This message is for those, who will come after us. We made a mistake.
We thought we had found the future for mankind.
It's not just an infection. It's something more.
Run, Elias!
Do not awaken that which must remain forgotten.
The Asterion settled onto the cracked earth with a metallic groan, its landing gear sinking slightly into the dust-covered ground. The sky above was a pale gray, the sun dulled behind a veil of ashen clouds. Dr. Elias Marlowe stood at the airlock, staring out at the expanse of forgotten structures that stretched like gravestones across the landscape. Colony 17 had once been hailed as humanity's triumph, a beacon of survival on a scarred and resurgent Earth. Now, it was a graveyard. Elias could feel the weight of history pressing down on him as the airlock door hissed open, releasing the stale scent of the ship and allowing the cold, metallic tang of the outside world to seep in. "Let's move," Elias said, his voice steady but quiet. The team followed him out. Naomi Harker, his sharp-eyed second-in-command, Marcus Bell, the stoic engineer, Alina Vasquez, the biologist, Dr. Cole Thane, the geologist, and Ethan Reeve, the communications officer. They fanned out cautiously, weapons holstered but close at hand. The settlement sprawled out before them, rows of prefabricated buildings, still standing but corroded by time and weather. Dust coated every surface, and long-dead vines clung to the walls like veins over brittle skin. The colony's entrance gate hung crooked on its hinges, swaying with the faint breeze. A faded banner reading, "Welcome to New Haven," flapped weakly, its words barely legible. Naomi was the first to speak. No bodies, no debris, nothing. She knelt by a rusted bench and ran her gloved hand over a patch of the greenish residue clinging to the surface. "What the hell is this?" Elias crouched beside her, his brow furrowed. The substance shimmered faintly, catching the dim light like oil on water. It had the consistency of mucus, thick and viscous. When Naomi scraped a small sample into a vial, a rancid chemical stench filled the air. "Biotic," Alina muttered as she peered at the residue. "Not plant-based, maybe fungal." "No fungus smells like that," Elias replied, standing and scanning the buildings. "It's something else." The settlement was silent, unnervingly so. No hum of power, no faint crackle of communication signals. Just the sound of the wind threading through hollow corridors. They moved deeper into the colony, passing abandoned storefronts and homes. The interior windows were dark, some cracked, others fogged over with a strange, filmy residue. A child's toy, a stuffed bear missing its button eye, sat discarded in the middle of the street. Its fur was stained with the same greenish slime. "Where the hell did everyone go?" Marcus muttered, his voice low. "Look at this," Ethan called out. He was standing near the colony's central hall, a massive structure with reinforced steel walls and a vaulted roof. He pointed at the doorframe. Someone had carved deep grooves into the metal, almost like tally marks. But when Elias stepped closer, he realized they weren't random. They followed a pattern, almost like vertebrae stacked along a spinal cord. "What do you think it means?" Naomi asked, her hand brushing over the ridges. Elias didn't answer. His gut told him the carvings weren't just decoration. They were warnings. As they made their way inside the central hall, the stale air grew heavier, thick with an acrid scent that stung their nostrils. The vast chamber was lined with empty desks and chairs scattered haphazardly across the floor. A large monitor flickered weakly at the front, its screen fractured but still displaying remnants of data, most of it scrambled into nonsense. Naomi tapped the console's keyboard, but the system was unresponsive. "We need to check the power grid." Elias nodded but barely heard her. His gaze had drifted to the far end of the hall, where the wall had collapsed inward, exposing the tunnel beneath. A strange, wet noise echoed from below, a faint dripping, slow and deliberate, like water falling into a cavernous well. He motioned for the others to stay back and approached the opening. The darkness below seemed to pulse with movement, shadows shifting just out of reach. A faint vibration traveled up through his boots, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. "Did anyone else feel that?" Elias whispered, stepping back. Naomi frowned and placed her hand against the wall. "It's warm." Elias exchanged a wary glance with Marcus before activating his headlamp. Its beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the rust-streaked ladder that led down into the maintenance tunnels. At first glance, it seemed normal. Old pipes, corroded metal. But as the light shifted, the walls began to glisten, as if they had been coated in something organic. "Don't," Naomi warned as Elias gripped the ladder. But he was already climbing down, unable to ignore the compulsion tugging at him. The air below was thick and damp, like breathing through a wet rag. The floor was slick beneath his boots, covered in a translucent slime that pulsed faintly beneath the light. Elias's heart pounded as he reached the bottom. The tunnel stretched out before him, winding deeper into the earth. And then he saw it. Something was embedded in the wall, a mass of fibrous tissue laced with veins that pulsed in time with the vibrations underfoot. At its center was a vaguely human shape, fused to the wall as though it had grown there. The remains of its face were twisted and featureless, its mouth a grotesque hollow. Elias staggered back, bile rising in his throat. His earpiece crackled to life with static. Through the distortion, he swore he heard something. A whisper, wet and garbled. "We tried." His blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from the comms. It was coming from the walls. Elias spun around and climbed back up the ladder, his hands shaking. As he pulled himself out of the tunnel, Naomi grabbed his arm. "What did you see?" Elias looked back down into the dark, his mind reeling. "We're not alone here." The team sat in the central hall's makeshift command center, surrounded by the hum of portable equipment they'd set up to compensate for the colony's dead systems. A lone lantern cast a weak glow over the space, deepening the shadows around them. Elias paced, trying to make sense of what he'd seen in the tunnels. Naomi broke the silence. "What exactly did you see?" Elias stopped, running a hand through his hair. "It was something embedded in the wall. It wasn't just dead, it was part of the structure. twisted like its body fused with the colony itself. The room fell silent. Alina shifted uneasily, her fingers drumming against the edge of the table. Maybe it was some kind of aberration, a mutation caused by exposure to something. Or someone trying to become something else, Ethan muttered grimly. What if it's not a mutation? What if it's an evolution? Naomi shot him a glare. Speculation won't help. We need facts. Marcus tapped at his tablet, frustration evident on his face. The power grid's fried. We'll need to head back into the maintenance level to restore the diagnostics. I'm going down there. Elias's gut twisted. Not alone. I'm coming with you. Naomi hesitated, but eventually nodded. Be careful. The tunnel was darker this time, the lanterns casting long, distorted shadows across the slick walls. The wet, organic sheen seemed to have spread since their last visit, covering more of the surface in thin, veiny tendrils that pulsed faintly in the dim light. Marcus scanned the wires feeding into the junction box, oblivious to the creeping unease building in Elias's chest. Something down here was alive, watching, waiting. The dripping sound was louder now, like the beating of a giant malformed heart. Elias strained his ears and realized the dripping wasn't random. It had a rhythm. Slow at first, then faster, almost like footsteps. Elias turned sharply, his light slicing through the dark. Nothing moved. The tunnel yawned in front of him, silent except for the sound of Marcus cursing under his breath as he pried open the access panel. There. Marcus grinned as the lights flickered back to life overhead. The sudden illumination made Elias squint, but then he noticed something new. The walls weren't just pulsing, they were shifting. Elias stepped forward and shone his light over the surface. Thin, membranous sheets stretched like skin over the metal plating. Beneath them, shadows squirmed, as if something was trying to push its way through. His stomach twisted when he noticed the faint imprint of a human hand pressed from the inside. Marcus saw it too and took a step back. What? Is that? The hand twitched. Marcus, move! Elias yelled. But it was too late. The wall burst open in a spray of viscous fluid as a figure stumbled out, falling to its knees. It was humanoid, or at least it had once been. Its face was a melted patchwork of bone and sinew, its eyes covered with a translucent membrane. Its jaw dangled loose, connected only by thick cords of tissue. The thing's chest heaved as it took a ragged breath, the sound wet and wrong. Marcus gagged and stumbled back. God, what is this? The creature's head tilted, its throat vibrating as it tried to speak. The sound was garbled, like words dragged through mud. Elias's blood ran cold as he listened to its fractured attempt at language. Help us. Elias's breath caught in his throat. The creature was trying to communicate. Marcus took a step closer, raising his hand. Are you human? He asked, voice trembling. The creature lurched forward, grabbing Marcus's wrist with astonishing strength. Marcus cried out, but the creature didn't attack. It dragged his hand toward its chest. Its skin was transparent in places, revealing what lay beneath. A twisted mass of bone and organs, barely recognizable. Its heart was visible, a blackened, pulsating thing threaded with veins that pulsed with a sickly green hue. Marcus struggled, but the creature's grip tightened. Its mouth gaped wide as if it were trying to say something else. "Run!" The word was clearer this time, a desperate plea. The creature released Marcus and collapsed, its body convulsing. A sickening crack filled the air as its ribcage split apart, releasing a spray of spore-like mist. Elias grabbed Marcus and yanked him away, covering his mouth with his sleeve as they retreated down the tunnel. Behind them, more shapes began to stir within the walls. Dozens of figures writhed beneath the membrane, their faces distorted and desperate. Some were pressing against the surface as if trying to break free, while others melted deeper into the organic mass, becoming part of the living architecture. The tunnel erupted with noise, gurgling cries and wet, scraping sounds as the figures began to emerge. Elias and Marcus sprinted toward the ladder, the wet slap of bare feet echoing behind them. The creatures were slow, dragging their misshapen limbs, but there were so many. As they reached the top, Elias slammed the hatch shut and bolted it. The pounding began almost immediately, soft at first, then frantic. The door began to buckle. "Get back!" Naomi yelled, pulling them away. Alina stared at Marcus in horror. What happened down there? "They're trying to warn us," Elias gasped. His lungs burned from the spores. He could still hear the broken words in his head. "They're human. Or they were. Whatever's down there, it's changing them, rewriting their bodies." The pounding on the hatch grew louder. Cracks spidered across the surface. Naomi grabbed Elias's arm, forcing him to meet her gaze. What are they warning us about? Elias's mind raced. He thought of the carvings, the strange pulses beneath their feet, the living mass. Something bigger, something worse. Then the pounding stopped. A thick, suffocating silence followed. Everyone held their breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no wet rasp of breath. The hallway stretched out before them like an open grave. Marcus's face was pale, sweat dripping down his temples. Why did they stop? Elias didn't have an answer, and then, in the distance, something deep within the colony rumbled. It wasn't an explosion, it was the sound of something waking up. The colony shuddered with a deep, bone-rattling groan, as if the entire structure had taken a breath. Dust drifted from the ceiling in thin streams. The team stood frozen, staring at the trembling walls. Naomi broke the silence. What was that? Elias's pulse pounded in his ears. He knew, deep down, that the sound wasn't mechanical. It wasn't the reactor or some failing structure. It was something alive. "We need answers," Elias said, his voice rough but steady. "The mainframe logs. There might be something we missed. Naomi, Ethan, get the logs online. Everyone else, fortify this room." Naomi and Ethan hurried to the main console, tapping furiously at the keyboard as they tried to bypass the damaged circuits. Alina and Marcus dragged metal desks and crates to barricade the doors, while Elias kept watch by the observation window. He could still see the tunnel hatch below, unmoving but slick with greenish residue. No sign of the creatures. Yet. The console beeped as fragments of garbled text began to fill the screen. Naomi's brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of the corrupted data. "Most of the files are corrupted," she muttered. "But I've got something. A log entry from the colony's chief biologist, Dr. Eleanor Graves. A video feed flickered to life, a shaky recording. Dr. Graves's face appeared, pale and drenched in sweat. Her eyes were sunken, the skin around them raw and bruised. She leaned closer to the camera, her breath ragged. "To anyone who finds this," she began, voice trembling, "we made a mistake." The room fell silent as the team listened. Graves swallowed hard, her throat convulsing. "We thought it was a miracle, a substance that could heal cellular damage, regenerate tissue. But it wasn't healing us. It was rewriting us. The spores, they're intelligent. They adapt. They become. And once they enter you, they take control." She let out a hollow, broken laugh that made the hair on the back of Elias's neck rise. We didn't realize until too late. The first signs were subtle, muscle twitches, altered speech patterns. Then came the changes. She exhaled shakily. I watched my colleagues twist into something else. Their bodies didn't belong to them anymore. Naomi's fingers tightened on the console as Graves' eyes filled with tears. We tried to contain it, but the organism was already fused with the colony's infrastructure. It's everywhere now. We're breathing it, touching it. There's no cure, only assimilation. If you're hearing this, leave. Blow it all to hell. The screen went dark. A long, heavy silence filled the room. Naomi's face was pale as she whispered, "She knew." They all knew. Elias exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. They didn't leave because they couldn't. The colony itself became a trap. Marcus slammed a fist against the wall, his face twisted in anger and fear. "So what the hell are we supposed to do now?" "We're already exposed." "Wait," Ethan said, staring at the dark screen. "Did you hear it?" Naomi frowned. "Hear what?" Ethan replayed the video, turning up the volume. They listened again, and this time they heard it. A faint, wet sound beneath Graves' voice. A whisper, warped and hollow. "Not alone." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Elias felt his skin prickle as he leaned in closer. Naomi shook her head. "It's an audio artifact. It has to be." But deep down, none of them believed that. Suddenly, the comms crackled to life, spewing garbled static. Everyone turned toward Ethan, who frantically adjusted the dials, trying to isolate the signal. A voice broke through, distorted, wet, and barely human. "Help us." The same broken plea they'd heard in the tunnels. But now there was something else, a deeper, almost mechanical resonance beneath the words. It wasn't just a single voice, it was many, layered and discordant, speaking through one throat. Naomi's face hardened. "It's a trick. The spores are trying to lure us out." But Elias's mind raced as he pieced the fragments together. The carvings, the warnings, the desperate cries. The creatures weren't hunting them. They were still fighting the infection, even as their bodies twisted and decayed. "They're not trying to lure us," Elias whispered. "They're trying to warn us." Ethan's head snapped up. "Warn us? About what?" A low rumble vibrated beneath their feet. The lights flickered as a distant guttural roar echoed through the colony, vibrating the metal walls. Alina clutched the edge of the table, her face pale with fear. "That didn't sound human. Elias's heart thudded in his chest as a horrible realization settled over him. The spores aren't the only thing down here. The comms crackled again, but this time the voices were frantic, overlapping in a cacophony of broken pleas. It wakes. It hungers. The team exchanged horrified glances. Something far worse than the infected colonists was stirring beneath the surface. Naomi grabbed Elias's arm, her expression wild with fear. If there's something else down there, then we need to leave. Now. Elias hesitated. We can't just run. If this thing spreads... A deafening crash interrupted him as one of the doors buckled inward, bending under the force of something slamming against it. The sound reverberated through the room like a gunshot. "Brace the door!" Marcus shouted, shoving a metal crate against it. The others joined him, pressing their weight against the barricade. The pounding grew louder. Through the narrow gap in the metal, Elias caught a glimpse of a grotesque silhouette, a figure too large to be human, its skin stretched taut over unnaturally long limbs. Its chest split open as it roared, revealing a mass of writhing, tooth-like growths. Alina screamed. "What the hell is that?" Naomi grabbed Elias's sleeve. "We have to fall back to the ship." "No." Elias's mind raced as the creature slammed against the barricade again. "We won't make it to the ship in time unless we slow it down." "How?" Marcus's voice was hoarse. Elias glanced at the reactor access panel on the far wall. "The power core. If we overload it, we can trigger a meltdown." Naomi's eyes widened. "A meltdown? You're talking about blowing up the entire colony." "It's the only way," Elias said grimly. "If we don't, whatever's down there will spread, and there'll be no stopping it." The pounding at the door became frenzied, metal groaning under the strain. Naomi clenched her jaw and nodded. "Fine. But if we're doing this, we're doing it together." Elias didn't argue. There wasn't time. "Everyone, move!" "To the reactor room, now!" As they sprinted down the corridor, the sounds of shattering metal filled the air behind them. The creature was through, and it was coming for them. The corridor groaned beneath their feet as the team sprinted toward the reactor room. The colony trembled with every step, as if the very walls were alive and writhing in agony. The creature's roar echoed behind them, low and wet, like the sound of bones scraping against marrow. Elias didn't dare look back. He didn't need to. The guttural, slavering sounds told him it was close. "Faster!" Naomi shouted, her breath ragged. Elias's legs burned as he pushed himself forward. Alina stumbled, and Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her upright. The group barreled into the reactor room just as another roar reverberated through the hall. Marcus slammed the door shut and engaged the emergency lock. "This won't hold long," he panted. Naomi ran to the reactor terminal, her fingers flying over the controls. The screen blinked to life, displaying warning after warning in a blood-red cascade. The power core thrummed in its chamber, encased in layers of reinforced glass, its bluish glow pulsing like a dying heartbeat. Elias stood behind her, sweat dripping into his eyes. How long to overload it? 5 minutes, Naomi muttered. Maybe less. Her fingers hesitated on the final confirmation key. Once I do this, there's no turning back. Elias rested a hand on her shoulder. "We don't have a choice." She swallowed hard and pressed the key. The reactor's hum intensified, rising to a shrill electric whine. The countdown appeared on the screen. 4:59, 4:58, 4:57. "Let's move," Naomi barked. They turned for the emergency exit, a service tunnel that led to the surface. The metal door groaned as it slid open, revealing a narrow passage bathed in dim red light. But before they could take a step, the far wall buckled inward with a deafening crash. The creature was here. It slammed its grotesque bulk through the metal plating, shredding it like paper. Now fully visible in the harsh glow of the reactor room, the thing was monstrous, a towering amalgamation of human and alien tissue. Its limbs were elongated, each ending in jagged, claw-like protrusions. Its face was a sickening parody of humanity, a hollow, melted visage where multiple eyes blinked in unison, and its mouth was a gaping chasm filled with rows of needle-like teeth. Alina screamed as the creature lunged, its claws tearing through the air. Elias shoved her out of the way and fired his rifle, the shots punching into the thing's chest. Black ichor sprayed across the room, hissing as it burned into the floor, but the creature barely flinched. Marcus grabbed a nearby fuel canister and hurled it at the creature. "Get clear!" he yelled. The canister exploded on impact, engulfing the creature in a fireball. The room shook as flames licked across the walls. For a moment, Elias thought they'd bought themselves time, but the fire only seemed to enrage it. The creature rose from the inferno, its charred skin sloughing off in thick, molten chunks. Its new glistening flesh pulsed as if regenerating in real time. Elias grabbed Naomi's hand. "Go! Now!" The team scrambled into the service tunnel. The creature's roars followed them, deafening, inhuman. Elias slammed the emergency release behind them, sealing the tunnel door. The thick steel vibrated as the beast pounded against it. They sprinted down the narrow tunnel, the countdown blaring in their ears through the comms. 2:12, 2:11. Elias's legs felt like lead. His breaths came in ragged gasps. Naomi kept pace beside him, eyes wild with fear and determination. Marcus had Alina by the arm, half dragging her as she stumbled. The tunnel opened up into a ladder leading to the surface. Daylight shimmered faintly above them, a distant promise of escape. Naomi began to climb, her movements quick and practiced. Elias waved Alina upward next, then Marcus. The metal above them shrieked, a sound that made Elias's stomach twist. The creature was breaking through the final door. Ethan was the last to reach the ladder. "Go!" Elias shouted as he braced himself at the base of the shaft, rifle raised. The door at the end of the tunnel crumpled inward, and the creature dragged its massive body through the twisted opening. Elias pulled the trigger, unloading round after round, the recoil shaking his arms. The bullets ripped through the beast's flesh, slowing it down but not stopping it. It roared and lunged forward, its claws scraping the walls. Ethan's foot slipped as he climbed. "Elias!" he cried. Elias grabbed Ethan's leg and shoved him upward. "Climb!" he screamed. Ethan reached the top just as the creature lunged. Elias turned to run, but the thing was too fast. It swiped at his back, its claws raking deep into his side. Pain exploded through him as he fell to his knees. "Elias!" Naomi screamed from above. Blood poured from his wounds, staining the metal floor. The creature loomed over him, its mouth opening wide in a grotesque wet hiss. Elias's vision swam, but he forced himself to his feet. He reached for the emergency detonation switch strapped to his belt, the backup failsafe he'd brought in case the countdown failed. The creature lunged, but Elias was faster. He slammed his fist onto the switch. The world slowed. Elias felt a strange calm as he looked up at Naomi one last time. She was reaching for him, her face contorted in horror. He managed a faint smile. Run. The reactor core detonated with a blinding flash of white light. The shockwave ripped through the colony, incinerating everything in its path. The surface of the earth split open, fire and ash billowing into the sky. Naomi, Ethan, Marcus, and Alina were thrown clear as the explosion roared behind them. The shockwave flattened the nearby hills, turning the landscape into a scorched wasteland. Naomi's ears rang as she sat up, her body trembling. The others were alive, coughing and covered in ash. But Elias was gone. The colony was gone. The crater where the settlement had stood smoldered like a dying wound. All that remained was silence. Naomi staggered to her feet, staring at the devastation. Her throat tightened as tears blurred her vision. The memory of Elias's final smile burned in her mind. She whispered his name, but there was no answer. Only the distant howl of the wind. A crackling sound came from her comms, static, faint but insistent. Naomi hesitated, then pressed the receiver to her ear. Do not awaken what you do not understand. Some things should remain buried. It was Elias's voice, fractured and ghostly. Then the line went dead. Naomi closed her eyes, letting the words sink into her heart. She turned toward the others, her resolve hardening. Whatever happened here, the world had to know the truth. Elias's sacrifice couldn't be in vain. The sky darkened as ash drifted like snow over the barren landscape. Far below, in the shattered remains of the colony, something stirred. And somewhere in the void, the echoes of broken voices whispered on the wind, carried to a world that would never truly understand what had been lost.